with me here on set now, our international affairs editor, Kethevane Gorjestani. Kethevane, let's go back to where we were at the start of the news bulletin, that Trump speech, of course. What are your main takeaways from his address?
Well, look, first of all, this is a speech that sounded quite a lot like the speech that maybe the U.S. president would have given at the start of the war. And he actually said this line. He said, "I want to discuss why Operation Epic Fury is necessary for the safety of America." This is something where you lay out the why you are getting into a war. You don't do that 32 days into the war. And especially since he said that, but then he didn't really make the case. He didn't talk about, for example, the imminence of the nuclear threat. He talked about the nuclear threat of Iran, but not the imminence. He also talked about this idea that Iran was close to building missiles that could hit the U.S. homeland, which by all accounts is actually not true. The second thing is that the formality of an address to the nation, the pomp and circumstance, usually gives the expectation, at least to the American people, that you're going to have a big announcement, you're going to get information. And we left after 20 minutes with very little new information about this war. What we got from the president is a sort of a mission almost accomplished sort of a message, and the idea that there is no firm end to the war. Donald Trump talked about 2 to 3 weeks, but we know that Donald Trump likes to put a sort of time frame on everything, and often it lands on around 2 weeks. What I thought was interesting in this speech was not so much what Donald Trump said, but what was left out of the speech. There was no use of the word uranium. We talked a lot about enriched uranium. Donald Trump insisted that he would not let the Iranians keep that enriched uranium. Now we're not talking about this. He simply hinted at the fact that basically it was buried so deep that even the Iranians wouldn't be able to get their hands on it. Boots on the ground. No mention, no talk about whether or not this buildup of Marines and other paratroopers was going somewhere or not. And finally, barely a mention of talks of those negotiations that for the past week Donald Trump has said are going extremely well, and no mention of the previous deadline that we've had, which was April 6th. That seems to have disappeared.
And bearing in mind what Reza was saying there in Tehran, I mean, Trump saying the US core strategic objectives are nearing completion. But is that actually the case? As Reza was telling us, they've started to bomb very much non-military targets as well.
Absolutely. And that is the problem of having sort of shifting objectives. Obviously, the main one that we started out with, that is still one of the main goals, is to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. Now, I mentioned the stockpile of enriched uranium. That's still there, so possibly at some point the Iranians could get their hands back on it. But at the same time, the Americans insist that they have obliterated Iran's nuclear program, or are very close to really making it impossible for the Iranians to use. He talked about destroying the Navy, destroying the Air Force. Those were not initially actual objectives, but that has in large part been done. The question of the ballistic missiles and drone capabilities, that is a big question, because the United States and Israel are saying numbers from 90 to 95%, completely crippling the ballistic missile program and the drone program, that the even the factories that make them have been destroyed. But Iran shows almost daily that it can still target Israel, it can still target Gulf states, and it can still target U.S. interests in the Middle East. So even if they have been crippled, they have not eliminated the threat from Iran. Support for proxies, we don't really know where that stands, and we're seeing with Hezbollah that at least those proxies are still able to operate, in also the Houthis. I'll finish with one phrase that Donald Trump used when he talked about the regime change, because that was something that has been varying. He said, regime change was not our goal. We never said regime change, but regime change has occurred because of all their original leaders being dead. The new group is less radical, much more reasonable. Not our goal. Well, if you ask some of the Iranians who were waiting for the help of the Israelis and the Americans, maybe they didn't hear it exactly that way. Has it occurred or not? The idea that simply cutting off the leadership and replacing them with somebody else is regime change is a little bit odd, considering that the Islamic Republic of Iran is still there, the system is still there. And now to this idea that these people are less radical and more reasonable, by all accounts, that is absolutely not true. It seems that the people who have replaced those who have been killed are more radical, and the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard Corps, is stronger than it was at the beginning of this war.
Finally, Kethevane, let's talk about the thing that we haven't talked about yet. That's NATO. Donald Trump, of course, talked about it earlier in the day before he made that speech, threatening to pull out. No mention of it at all in his speech, though. I mean, is it a serious threat that the US may pull out of NATO?
Look, it's serious in the sense that Donald Trump really feels very strongly about this. And it's not just the past week or the past months, it's the past years. He feels that the United States has been taken advantage of when it comes to its place in the NATO alliance, and that other countries are not doing enough of their fair share. He said this latest utterance of considering withdrawing the United States from NATO, both to the Telegraph and to Reuters. Now, technically, he cannot pull the United States out of NATO unilaterally. A law passed in Congress at the end of 2023 requires the consent of 2/3 of the Senate or an act of Congress. 2/3 of the Senate, the votes are simply not there because you would need all of the Republicans, and there are plenty of Republicans who still feel very strongly about how important NATO is, plus around 13 or 14 Democrats. That's simply not going to happen. And an act of Congress would be even probably harder. And this is interesting because, of course, the bill at the time was co-sponsored by the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, and later passed as part as the National Defense Authorization Act of 2024. That said, one Republican who is a big supporter of the NATO alliance, Tom Tillis, who is the top Republican on the NATO observation group, he said this. He said, the President of the United States cannot withdraw from NATO. He can poison the well. He can make it functionally defunct if he wants to. That is absolutely true. You don't need to pull out of NATO to make a very big mess of NATO. Donald Trump could pull out the troops that are stationed in NATO member states, like in Germany, for example. He could also pull U.S. officers from NATO command structure. And he could also simply hint at the fact that he would not help militarily bring military support if any NATO member state ever needed it. And all of that would be enough to create a real problem. If the United States is no longer a real and reasonable and reliable ally within the alliance, this alliance loses quite a bit of its strength. And that is why the threat of Donald Trump has to be taken seriously.
Kethevane, thanks very much. Kethevane Gorjestani, International Affairs Editor here on France 24.